Up next in the broadcast, President Park Geun-hye expressed his remorse over Pyongyang's latest provocative move of firing shells across the maritime border, especially as the nation is still mourning the loss of the Sewol-ho ferry sinking. With the ferry disaster and its aftermath fueling campaign agendas for the June 4th local elections, the latest responses in national politics may affect how voters punch their regional ballots. Thailand's military suspends most of the constitution and imposes travel bans on numerous politicians after its coup. It says it's to restore peace, but world leaders have been quick to condemn the moves. Primetime News begins now.
Hello everybody, happy Friday. I'm Kang Tae-ri.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thanks for joining us for Primetime News. We begin with the response from the nation's top office to North Korea's latest aggressions. President Park Geun-hye called for a meeting with her security ministers on Friday following North Korea's shelling across the western maritime border the night before.
She expressed a deep regret over Pyongyang's latest provocation as South Korea is still mourning the loss of hundreds of lives from last month's ferry disaster. The president called on the military and related agencies to stay focused on protecting the safety of South Koreans living on the western seaborder islands. She also discussed bolstering Seoul's defense readiness with Washington and cooperating with neighboring countries like China when it comes to North Korea issues. And speaking of the maritime firing, after North Korea denied firing 2 artillery shells near a South Korean warship in the West Sea, Seoul denounced Pyongyang.
The communist state claims that the South Korean warship crossed its maritime border to launch an attack and that Seoul was trying to fabricate the incident. South Korea's defense ministry slammed the North's claims as being far-fetched and a blatant lie to shun responsibility. Seoul's defense ministry said the series of threats from Pyongyang were aimed at disrupting the South Korean Navy's normal guard operations and putting the northern limit line into dispute in an attempt to nullify the maritime border. On May 24, 2010, South Korea slapped a handful of economic sanctions on North Korea for its torpedo attack on a South Korean warship that killed 46 South Korean sailors. But some have called for a scale back for the sake of improving inter-Korean relations.
And our Unification Ministry correspondent Hwang Sung-hee is joining us in our studio to paint us a clearer picture. So let's start off with the sanctions themselves, Sung-hee.
Well, the so-called May 24th sanctions cut off all government-led financial support for North Korea, suspended inter-Korean projects, and banned new investments in the north except for their jointly run Kaesong industrial complex. Now this in response to North Korea's sinking of the South Korean warship Cheonan. But many North Korea experts are now calling for the sanctions to be lifted. A recent survey of North Korea experts shows that 9 out of 10 respondents said the sanctions should be either lifted or eased to expand inter-Korean economic ties and ease tensions on the peninsula.
So tell us how far these sanctions have gone to impact the economic exchange between the two Koreas.
Well, Sean, inter-Korean economic cooperation tumbled after the 2010 sanctions were put in place. At one point, trade volume between the two Koreas stood at nearly $3 billion, but this has dropped to around $1 to $2 billion. Now, this, of course, is because the only inter-Korean economic project today is the Kaesong industrial complex. Experts say the sanctions have caused more damage to South Korea than North Korea.
South Korean small and medium-sized companies and conglomerates that invest in North Korea are now seeing economic losses from the May 24th sanctions. In contrast, North Korea has expanded trade with its allies like China and Russia, which have helped to minimize its losses from the sanctions.
In fact, if you could take a look at the graph here, data released by the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency yesterday shows that North Korea's trade volume jumped nearly 8% last year from the year earlier to over $7 billion. Now, trade with China made up around 90% of that total as Pyongyang's economic dependence on Beijing continues to grow.
Now, South Korean President Park Geun-hye has been, emphasizing the scenario of Korean unification a lot. So do you think lifting these sanctions is in line with that vision?
Well, many experts are saying that these sanctions are not only getting in the way of realizing these handful of inter-Korean projects put forth by President Park, but also efforts to prepare for a reunified Korea. The 결의말 근사전 Committee started out in 2005 with an ambitious goal of narrowing the language gap between the two Koreas by creating a joint dictionary. It's an important project, considering that the average South Korean only understands roughly 50% of the North Korean dialect and vice versa. Divided into two teams, South Korean and North Korean, they had been meeting about 4 times a year to work on the dictionary. But the project has been at a standstill for 4 years now, when the May 24th sanctions were put in place.
We haven't been able to hold meetings with the North Korean committee since 2010. The South Korean committee has finished our portion of the work over the 4 years, but we must receive the North Korean portion, which will make up about half of the dictionary.
Experts say lifting of the sanctions will serve as the first vital step towards bringing the two Koreas together. This, as most of President Park Geun-hye's inter-Korean project proposals, such as the Eurasia Initiative, a construction of railways running from South Korea to Europe via North Korea, Russia, and China, demand fresh investments in the north. But will the sanctions be lifted once and for all?
Rather than an immediate lifting of the May 24th sanctions, South Korea could become more flexible with the measures following its local elections on June 4th, and as positive changes are seen in inter-Korean relations and North Korea's nuclear program.
Of course, the South Korean government, however, stresses that the May 24th sanctions will remain in place until North Korea takes responsibility for its sinking of the South Korean warship Thaliand 4 years ago.
All right, Sung-hee, thank you so much for that report.
My pleasure.
Curry's comments came in response to
your gateway to the day's biggest stories in Korea and around the world. Breaking news, the hottest interviews, and a whole lot more. Join Arirang Sean Lim and Kang Chae-ri from the heart of Seoul.
Begins now.
Primetime news, weeknights, live at 10 on Arirang TV.
With Korea's local elections set for June 4th, we're trying to figure out how the April ferry disaster is going to impact the outcome of the elections, with the government criticized for its poor handling of the accident. Polls did show a sharp drop in support for the ruling party immediately after the accident, but that number has been picking up, suggesting President Park Geun-hye's apology and moves to shake up her people may have given the party a boost. Park Ji-won tells us more.
The failed handling of the Sewol-ho ferry disaster has hit the incumbent administration hard. Since the accident in mid-April, President Park Geun-hye's approval rating had been on a steady decline, dropping to 51% in the second week of May, according to public opinion research firm Realmeter. But the president's apology to the nation this week may have turned the tide. Media research has Park's approval rating rebounding to the 60% range for the first time since the ferry disaster, up to 62%. Research View also says President Park's public address on Monday pushed up her positive ratings by 4 percentage points this week compared to the previous one. Both polls surveyed some 1,000 people nationwide over the age of 19. Political analysts say her appointing of reform-minded former Supreme Court Justice An Dae-hee as new prime minister and accepting the resignations of her top security advisors could also play a role in gathering conservative support at the elections.
Due to prevailing negative views about the ruling party following its poor handling of the disaster, conservative-inclined voters weren't able to outwardly express their support for the ruling party. The president's call for changes means the ability to support conservative candidates has been restored to some degree.
However, in a survey conducted by Research and Research, 40% of respondents said the ferry disaster affected their voting decisions, and nearly 60% of them said their support has shifted to opposition parties. Park Geun-hye, Arirang News.
Now let's take a look at the hottest battlegrounds for the June local elections and check on where voters stand in these regions. Myung-gil reports.
The metropolitan cities of Seoul and Incheon, along with Gyeonggi-do province, are shaking out to be the fiercest battlegrounds in this local election. Senior member of the ruling Saenuri party plan to join the campaign trail next week to throw their weight behind their mayoral hopefuls in Seoul and Incheon. They need all the help they can get. Ruling party candidate for Seoul Mayor Chung Mong-jun, who is trailing by 19 points in the polls behind incumbent Park Geun-hye, handed out food to elderly citizens at a welfare center while Park had lunch with college students. Over in the western port city of Incheon, the ruling party's mayoral candidate Yoo Jung-bok is also behind in the polls by more than 6 percentage points. He and his challenger in the race, incumbent Song Young-gil, visited elderly community centers. And in Gyeonggi-do province, where the race for governor is much tighter, the main opposition candidate Kim Jin-pyo of the New Politics Alliance for Democracy was joined on the campaign trail by co-chairman of the party, An Chol-soo. The ruling party's Nam Kyung-pil, who's in a neck-and-neck race with Kim, shook hands with the elderly at a welfare center in the city of Seongnam. An Chol-soo's presence in Gyeonggi was for a reason, as a win by the NPAD there would constitute a major win, as the province has a greater population than Seoul. The main opposition alliance is trying to appeal to undecided voters who may be disappointed by the government's poor handling of April's ferry disaster. Myung-gil, Arirang News.
Now, if we try really hard to give a positive spin to last month's ferry disaster, we can talk about the fact that the accident pushed lawmakers to take a long, hard look at an old bill that would redefine what constitutes corruption among public officials. Kim Ji-yeon tells us more.
An anti-corruption bill in Korea is gaining traction, a public outrage of the Sewol-ho ferry tragedy. Lawmakers will likely vote on the so-called Kim Young-lan bill, which is aimed at raising the bar of ethical practices for public officials. The bill is named after former Supreme Court Justice Kim Young-lan, who first proposed it during her term as chief of the Anticorruption and Civil Rights Commission of Korea. The bill sets grounds to criminally punish retired and incumbent public officials for colluding with interest groups. Bribery is defined in the legislation as a transfer of money or valuables worth more than 1 million Korean won, or about $976 between a public official and interest group, even if the deal is not followed by a favor. Lawmakers have been divided over the bill. Some have stood firmly against it since it was first proposed in 2012, claiming the bill would unnecessarily restrict the private lives of public servants. But there's been a shift after the ferry accident, as public calls have grown louder about reforms to ensure that similar tragedies don't occur. The Kim Young-lan bill has been forwarded to the Parliament's National Policy Committee for approval. If it passes there, it will be sent to a full session of the National Assembly, which could pass it as early as next week. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Japan has once again been called out for ignoring its past wrongdoings, this time by a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Loretta Sanchez didn't just aim her latest comments at Tokyo, but also called on her colleagues in the Senate to take action and to make sure that the former comfort women receive justice. Connie Kim has this story.
A U.S. Congresswoman in the Armed Services Committee has called on Japan to officially apologize for its sexual enslavement of women during World War II. Loretta Sanchez, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Korea, said at a meeting that Japan had still not apologized to the victims it caused to suffer more than 70 years and that their human rights need to be upheld. Urging her fellow congressmen to support the surviving comfort women, Sanchez called on the Japanese government to uphold a U.S. resolution passed in 2007 that calls on Tokyo to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept its historical responsibility for enslaving women during World War II and educate future generations of the horrific crimes that were carried out. Sanchez said earlier this month in a military plenary session that Japan's comfort woman issue cannot be dealt separately in the Obama administration's Asia rebalancing strategy. She warned that Japan needed to resolve its long-standing disputes in the region first. Experts say, however, Washington is taking a two-track approach towards Japan.
The U.S. welcomes Japan's push to restore its right to collective self-defense, but at the same time condemns Japan's historical wrongdoings. We can't say whether Washington values human rights issues more than they do security.
Lee added that Washington can always change its stance on the comfort women issue depending on its political interests in East Asia. Currently, less than 100 women of the 200,000 so-called comfort women are alive today. Meanwhile, a Japanese policy research center published a book in English recently that denies a past enforcement of sexual slavery. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
If this early hot weather is any indication, the summer will suck a lot of energy out of the nation's power grid, so the government and the nuclear energy industry are taking preemptive steps to prevent power shortages during the hot and sticky summer season. The Energy Ministry says the nation's nuclear power plants have been undergoing a special inspection this month, separate from regular checkups. Last summer, several nuclear reactors went offline either due to regular inspections or because they were found to have used parts with forged safety certificates. The government had to ask the public to voluntarily slash their energy usage when the nation was hit by a prolonged heat wave. Korea has a total of 23 nuclear reactors, which provide around 1/3 of the nation's total energy supply. And an achievement for Samsung, the electronics giant has unseated Sony as the #1 maker of UHD TVs, or ultra-high definition televisions. Samsung claimed 22% of the global UHD TV market in the first quarter, according to U.S. market analyzer Display Search. Sony, #1 last year, fell all the way to #5 with less than a 10% share.
The military coup in Thailand is facing widespread condemnation from international leaders after troops dispersed protest camps across the kingdom. And with more on this story, we now go to Paul E. at the News Center.
Paul, it appears the Thai army has nearly completed its takeover of the government, all without any bloodshed so far. But do we know what their next move will be?
Well, it still remains unclear what the Army's grand plan is at this point. What we do know is that one day after announcing it was staging a coup d'etat, the Thai military called in ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and other top state officials for questioning. Our Kwon So-won has more on this latest development.
Thailand's ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and more than 100 other political figures made an appearance for questioning at a military facility in Bangkok Friday on the army's request. There was no immediate word on what Yingluck or the others were asked about. It comes after the Thai military suspended most of the constitution and imposed a travel ban on 155 politicians after announcing a military coup d'etat on Thursday. They say the goal is to end the ongoing political turmoil in the country, but world leaders have been quick to condemn the move. It came just 2 days after the army's sudden declaration of martial law Tuesday, plus their earlier denial of a possible coup. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said there was no justification for the coup and warned of negative consequences.
At this point, what we're doing is we are reviewing our military and other assistance to the government of Thailand. We've taken preliminary steps to suspend military engagement and assistance while we consider the facts on the ground.
United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon voiced deep concern over the threat to the human rights of the Thai people and appealed for a prompt return to constitutional and democratic rule, as well as all-inclusive dialogue. The so far bloodless coup includes a nationwide curfew of 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., and soldiers have dispersed demonstrators at 2 main protest sites. Government programming is filling the airwaves and international news channels are blocked. Korea's foreign ministry raised its level 1 travel advisory that was in effect for much of Thailand to a level 2 on Friday, meaning travelers should take caution when traveling to or within the country. Kwon So-won, Arirang News.
President Vladimir Putin has slammed the wide range of sanctions imposed on Russia following its annexation of Crimea, while outlining his plans for a new Eurasian Union. Putin was speaking to business leaders at the annual St. Petersburg Economic Forum on Friday. Although the U.S. and European sanctions have targeted only a few dozen individuals and small firms, Russian officials say the threat of broader measures pose major economic consequences. However, Putin said the sanctions hurt everyone.
Isn't it obvious that economic sanctions as a tool of political pressure in the modern interdependent world have a boomerang effect and finally will affect the businesses and economies of the countries that initiated them?
The Russian leader also said he would respect the outcome of Ukraine's presidential election, which is scheduled for Sunday. The comments come a day after 16 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in clashes against heavily armed separatists. It's been 1 day since China's deadliest act of violence in the northeastern region of Xinjiang that killed at least 31 people and injured nearly 100 others. Chinese state media say that 5 suicide bombers carried out the brutal attack on Thursday in the city of Urumqi. The footage shows broken windows and damaged shops after attackers plowed 2 vehicles into an open market, hurling explosives. Most of the victims caught in the blast were elderly shoppers.
The fire burst out suddenly, and I didn't know what was happening. When I turned around, the car was already on top of me here. I felt like there was no one around and struggled to crawl out.
Beijing has blamed the worsening violence on insurgents from Xinjiang, home to the Uyghur Muslim minority. But human rights groups say China's repressive policies against religious freedoms may have fermented the unrest. That wraps up our look at international stories making headlines around the world. I'll see you back here next week.
Hello and welcome to Primetime Sports. I'm Stephen Che. The 2014 Incheon Asian Games is now a full house as North Korea on Friday announced that they'll participate in the event after skipping out on registration last week. They were the only eligible nation among the 45 Olympic Council of Asia member nations that had not committed amid high tensions on the Korean peninsula. Organizers welcomed the move, as did Seoul's Unification Ministry, which pledged to provide the necessary support for their athletes. China also praised the entry, expressing hope that it would help mend ties between the rival Koreas. Meanwhile, Pyongyang promised to honor the June 20th deadline to hand in their athlete roster. And over in Europe, the UEFA Champions League has reached its pinnacle with the tournament's 2 best teams facing off in the final in Lisbon. Now it's going to be Real Madrid taking on Atletico Madrid at the Estadio de Luz for the first ever final with teams hailing from the same city. And good news for the teams, as their top scorers, Real's Cristiano Ronaldo and Atletico's Diego Costa, have both vowed to be ready for the match. Kickoff is at 3:45 a.m. for those tuning in from Korea. And moving on to the MLB, the Texas Rangers defeated the Detroit Tigers 9-2, but the victory comes as one of their main bats have gone down for the year. The Rangers' $23 million man, Prince Fielder, is out indefinitely after opting for surgery for a herniated disc in his neck. And on that backdrop, Chu Shin-soo stepped up to power the offense with a home run, his second in as many games, while Yu Darvish earned a win from the mound. And coming all the way back home, it's time for Friday's top KBO matchup. The Nexen Heroes took on the Samsung Lions. Now we're back in Daegu after spending some time in Pohang, and both starters shine out of the gate. Then we go to the bottom 6th. A wild pitch brings a run home. Then the pitchers change, but it doesn't matter because more runs come home, all before Choi Young-woo and Park Seok-min both go deep. It's 6-0 Lions. Nexen gets some back, but it's just not enough. Samsung wins this one 6-3. And looking at the other games, Tusan takes down Hanwha 11-5. Meanwhile, Lotte beats Kia 3-2, and LG and SK are still in this one. It's 10-6 in the bottom of the 9th. Well, that's all I have for now. This has been Stephen Che. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you back here for more from the world of sports.
It was a hot afternoon here in Seoul, and tomorrow holds more of the same.
And our Kim Bo-kyung is standing by for us at the Weather Center with more. Bo-kyung, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, guys. Hongdo Beach, located in Jeollanam-do province, opened today, which is the first of many beaches to open ahead of summer. At the moment, we are seeing fairly clear skies due to a high pressure system from the East Sea. Now, Saturday is shaping up to be similar to today. However, late night showers are forecast on Sunday. If you are planning outdoor activities for Saturday, keep in mind the high UV level, which should continue to hit the very high range in the southern regions. Tomorrow's daytime highs on the eastern coastal regions will jump to the low 30s, which is approximately 10 degrees hotter compared to today. Taking a closer look at Saturday's readings, Seoul and Gwangju hit 29 degrees, while Daegu soars to a hot 32. Other places such as Jeju and Mount Kumgang make it to the mid-20s, while Dokdo tops out at 21. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday evening and tune in for more after midnight.
And that does it for us tonight on Primetime News. Thanks for watching.
Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you back here on Monday. Good night.